In October of 2024, a doctoral student named Luke Ald Thomas was sitting at a computer in Louisiana, scrolling through a laser survey of the Mexican jungle, flown for something else entirely. And buried in that data was a city no archaeologist had ever recorded. Pyramids, plazas, a ball court, thousands of structures under the canopy in Campeche. Within days, thumbnails start popping up telling you this lost city proves the Book of Mormon. It doesn't. But the folks firing back that there's zero evidence for the book, they're wrong too. So tonight we're doing the audit neither side wants. New evidence for the Book of Mormon, and what actually changed by 2026. Let me name the problem straight out, because it's the reason this episode exists. When it comes to Book of Mormon evidence, you get offered two things, and they're both junk. The first is the victory lap. Every altar, every ruin, every statistical study gets announced like a courtroom verdict. Proof at last. Case closed. Go share it with your doubting nephew. The second is the brush off. Zero evidence. Nothing. Not a single find. Don't even bother looking. One is selling you certainty. The other is selling you permission to stop thinking. And neither one tells you what a careful person would say, which is this. There's real stuff here. Some of it is genuinely strange. Some of it cuts hard against the book, and almost none of it is settled. If you've been watching this channel, you know my promise, and it doesn't bend for a topic this loaded. I'll take the question seriously, I'll treat every side fairly, and I'll stay faithful without getting loud about it. That promise gets tested tonight, because I'm going to show you the strongest evidence for this book, then the strongest case against it, both at full strength. No padding on the gloves. Before we go any further, one honest minute. This channel is still young, and it exists to tell the story of this faith, the way the records actually tell it, and to share the word of the restoration with people who only ever heard the cartoon version. If that's worth something to you, a like and a subscribe genuinely move the needle for a small channel finding its footing. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Reading those is the best part of my week. Now, before we get into the evidence, we've got to talk about the rules for a second. What actually counts here and what doesn't. I know, rules sound like homework, but stay with me, because if we skip this part, everything after it is just noise. And I'll tell you up front where this ends. It ends in the hardest place there is, the Americas, the archaeology, the DNA, the ground where the critics are strongest. And when we get there, I'm going to build their case the way a sharp critic would, before I say one word back. Along the way, there's a finding from 2024, buried inside the text itself. So strange, even the faithful scholars who turned it up can't agree on what it means. But the one thing I need you carrying the whole way through, because it's the whole point of tonight, is this. Suggestive is not settled. Two different words, and nearly every fight over this stuff kicks off the second somebody swaps one for the other. If you were with me for the Golden Plates episode, you already watched me do this with the witnesses. Hardest case against them first, then the weighing. Same tonight. Just a lot more on the table. So let's set the rules of the game. And let's set them before we know whose side they help. Because a standard you only apply when it favors you isn't a standard. It's a costume. Start with the word itself. Evidence is not proof. Evidence is anything that makes a claim more or less likely to be true, and it comes in different weights. A fingerprint is heavy. A rumor is light. Proof is what you've got when the weight piles up so high that denying it becomes unreasonable. Courtrooms need proof. History almost never gets it. What history gets is convergence, a bunch of separate lines all pointing the same way. And a careful historian talks in probabilities, not verdicts. So when I tell you there's real evidence for the Book of Mormon, hear me precisely. I'm not saying proof. I'm saying here's a data point, weigh it. And when a critic says there's evidence against it, same deal. It's a data point. The question is always, how much does it weigh? Now, if you're new to all this, here's the 15-second version of what we're testing. The Book of Mormon is the book Latter-day Saints hold as scripture, right alongside the Bible. Joseph Smith published it in 1830, and he said it was a translation of an ancient record, engraved on metal plates, telling the story of families who left Jerusalem around 600 years before Christ, crossed the ocean, and built up civilizations somewhere in the Americas. That's a historical claim. And historical claims either leave fingerprints or they don't. That's the whole reason this field exists. It's called apologetics, from an old Greek word for a spoken defense. And it just means the organized case for what a faith claims. Sounds like apologizing. It isn't. So what would count as evidence here? The best test I know is riskiness. A detail is strong evidence when the author had no normal way of getting it right and every normal way of getting it wrong. So if the book names a specific place in a specific spot that nobody in New York in 1829 could have known about, and that place turns out to be real, that's risky. That counts. But watch what that same rule does to me. If a scientific test could have proven the book right, and instead comes back against it, that counts too. I don't get to cheer the test when it helps me, and wave it off when it doesn't. So hold me to that tonight, because the DNA question is coming, and that's exactly the shape it has. And there's one more rule, the one the thumbnails break every time. Parallels are cheap. Take any two big things and you can make them look alike if you get to pick the comparisons. An ancient city with pyramids is not evidence for the Book of Mormon just because the book has cities in it. The find has to match something specific the text actually says, at the right time, in the right place. A real match would look like this. Say a trench in Chiapas someday turns up a carved stone reading Zarahemla, a king's name straight out of the book, under a date glyph in the right century. That ends the argument, and both sides know it. Nothing like that exists. Everything we're about to weigh sits lower on the scale, and saying so out loud is the difference between an honest audit and running an ad. Most of what gets shouted at you doesn't pass it. A few quiet things do. And that gap is where this whole subject actually lives. So let's start with the strongest evidence there is. And it's not in the Americas. It's out in the Arabian desert, on the trail the book describes before anybody ever gets on a boat. The opening chapters of the Book of Mormon are basically a travel log. A family leaves Jerusalem around 600 before Christ, heads down toward the Red Sea, and pushes south-southeast through some of the worst terrain on earth. And in the 16th chapter of 1 Nephi, there's this small, strange sentence. One of the group, a man named Ishmael, dies along the way. And the record says he was buried in the place which was called Nahom. Now look closely at that phrasing, because it's doing something quiet. Everywhere else in the story, the travelers name the places themselves. A valley for a father, a river for a son. But not here. Here the text says the place was called Nahom. Passive. Somebody else had already named it. And that means, if this account is real, Nahom should be findable. A named place, on an actual map, sitting there under that name around 600 before Christ. That is about as risky as an ancient text can get. So here's what's actually sitting in the ground. Starting in 1988, a German archaeological team digging at the Baran Temple near Marib in Yemen pulled up stone altars. They were donated by a man the inscription identifies as a member of the tribe of Nim. Same three root consonants, N, H, M, in the right corner of Arabia. The excavators dated those altars to roughly the 7th or 6th century before Christ, and some more recent work on Arabian chronology would push them even earlier, back toward 800 to 700 before Christ. Either way, the name is sitting right there in carved stone, in Lehi's century or before it, in the exact place the journey needs it to be. A Brigham Young University scholar named S. Kent Brown laid the altars out for Latter-day Saint readers in a paper he called The Place That Was Called Nahom. And that tribal name isn't some relic that vanished either. The Nim tribe is still in Yemen today, still holding land in that same region nearly 3,000 years later. And the record makes a second claim right on the heels of the first. After Nahom, it says the party turned and traveled nearly eastward, which is the exact turn the old incense trail takes toward the coast of Oman. And then comes the claim critics back in the 1800s thought was the most ridiculous of the whole book. The text says that after years in that wilderness, the family reached a coastal place so green, they named it Bountiful. Lots of fruit, wild honey, timber enough to build a ship. A lush garden on the Arabian coast? That sounded exactly like a farm boy guessing about a place he'd never seen. Except the garden is there. A researcher named Warren Aston spent decades on field expeditions walking that coastline. And there's a small cluster of inlets in southern Oman, the best known called Khor Karfot, at the mouth of a valley called Wadi Saik, that tick the essential boxes: standing fresh water, fig trees, fruit, timber, a mountain right over the sea, and it's due east of the Nim country. Let me be honest about the ceiling on this. Nobody's found a campsite or a shipyard. Several inlets compete for the spot, and a green coastline just proves Arabia has a green coastline, not that a family from Jerusalem ever stood on it. What the eastward turn and the fertile coast give us is narrower and still remarkable. A book dictated on a farm in New York describes a route across Arabia with a named burial ground right where the name is, a turn right where the trail turns, and a garden right where the garden is. So now let's flip it over and look at the other side, because this is where I keep my promise. A skeptic looks at those same altars and makes 3 points, and honestly, they're fair ones. 1. NHM is a tribal name in those inscriptions. It's not a road sign pointing at a burial ground. The match is a root, 3 consonants, in a language family where that root isn't even rare. Hebrew itself has words on that same root tied to mourning and comfort, which a critic will tell you is exactly the kind of name a writer would make up for a burial scene. 2. Ancient South Arabian script doesn't write vowels, so nobody actually knows if that tribe's name even sounded like Nahom. And 3. The name wasn't perfectly unknowable in Joseph Smith's day. There are European maps of Arabia from the 1700s that mark a region in Yemen with names like Nahom. Nobody's ever put one of those maps in Joseph Smith's hands. A poor farm family in upstate New York was not exactly sitting on a collection of European cartography. But you can't rule it out, and honesty means saying so. The historian Dan Vogel has pushed a version of these objections for years, and he's right about the limit. The altars don't prove Ishmael was buried anywhere. So weigh it fairly. What the altars give us is that the name existed in the right place at the right time, just like the book needs, and in a way nobody in 1829 could have checked. What they don't give us is proof the journey ever happened. That's the difference between a real clue and a done deal, and I'm not going to blur the two. But while we're still in the old world, there's one more piece, and this one answers the oldest objection this book ever got hit with. Back in 1830, the idea of ancient scripture engraved on metal plates was treated as obviously ridiculous. Books were scrolls. Everybody knew that. Golden plates were a fantasy. Then, in 1979, an Israeli archaeologist named Gabriel Barkai was digging out burial caves at a site called Ketef Hinnom, on the shoulder of a valley just outside the walls of Old Jerusalem. In one chamber, his team found 2 little rolled-up sheets of silver. When they finally got them unrolled, there was the priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers. "The Lord bless thee and keep thee," scratched right into the metal in ancient Hebrew letters. They date to around 600 before Christ, which makes them the oldest surviving words of the Bible found anywhere on earth, older than the Dead Sea Scrolls by centuries. Sit with that picture. The oldest Bible text we have is Scripture, written on metal, buried in the ground, from Jerusalem, from the exact generation the Book of Mormon says a family walked out of that same city carrying Scripture written on metal. That doesn't prove a single Nephite ever lived, but it does prove the mockery was aimed at the one detail the ancient world turned out to back up. That's the ground. Now we go somewhere stranger, into the text itself, into the patterns hiding in the words, where the newest finding in this whole subject is also the hardest one to explain from any direction. In 1967, a young Latter-day Saint missionary named John Welch was serving in Germany when he sat in on a lecture about something called chiasmus. Let me tell you what that word means, because it's carrying a lot here. Chiasmus is a mirror structure in ancient writing, especially Hebrew writing. You lay ideas out in one order and then repeat them in reverse. First A, then B, then C, and then back out again, C, then B, then A, with the turning point in the middle carrying the whole meaning. Biblical scholars had already mapped it all over the Old Testament, so Welch went looking for it in the Book of Mormon and found it. Little mirrors at first, in a sermon over in the Book of Mosiah, and then a big one. The 36th chapter of the Book of Alma, a conversion story, reads as one long, sustained mirror. Dozens of elements descending into a center and then climbing back out in reverse. And the center, the hinge the whole chapter turns on, is the name of Jesus Christ. And you can see where the argument goes. A 23-year-old, just dictating off the top of his head in 1829, is not supposed to produce an elegant ancient Hebrew literary form that English-speaking scholars had barely started talking about yet. Now here's the strongest pushback, and it's a good one. In the independent journal Dialogue, a researcher named Earl Wonderly went through Alma 36 line by line and argued the mirror is partly manufactured. His real point is about method. The chapter has way more elements in it than the tidy diagram uses, and the person drawing the diagram gets to choose which phrases count and which get ignored. And with enough choosing, he says, you can pull a chiasm out of almost any rich piece of text. He's got a point, and careful Latter-day Saint scholars, Welch included, have admitted the field needed real standards, and they built criteria for what should count as a deliberate mirror versus an accident. So where does that leave us? In my read, it's weaker than the fireside version and stronger than the debunking. The loose examples should be dropped, but the strongest ones are still genuinely hard to explain as an accident, and they sat right there in the book, unnoticed, for 137 years before anybody thought to look. So call it suggestive. You know the refrain by now. Suggestive is not settled. There's a smaller one in the same vein, and I love it because it's so quiet. The most important prophet in the book after the founding family is a man named Alma, and for a long time critics chalked that name up to a careless mistake, because in Joseph Smith's world, Alma was a woman's name. It's Latin. It's the word you hear in Alma Mater. Ancient Israelite men were not supposed to be named Alma. Then, in the early 1960s, the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin was excavating caves near the Dead Sea and pulled out land documents from the 2nd century. And one of them records a Jewish man named Alma, son of Yehuda. A real Semitic man's name after all, sitting in the ground for 18 centuries. Now, one name is a small thing, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. A lucky syllable proves nothing on its own. But notice which direction this goes, because it's the same direction as Nahom. A detail that looked like a blunder in 1830 gets quietly turned into a bullseye a century later. And that's happened often enough that the zero evidence crowd should at least be curious about the pattern. Then there's stylometry, basically the statistics of writing style. Every writer leans on the little function words, the ands, the untos, at rates they don't consciously control. And once you've got enough text, those rates become something like a fingerprint. In 1980, 3 researchers at Brigham Young University, Wayne Larson, Alvin Rencher, and Tim Layton, ran those tests across the Book of Mormon and reported 2 things. 1. The book splits into several distinct authorial voices, which tracks the different narrators the text itself claims. And 2, none of those voices matched Joseph Smith, or his scribe Oliver Cowdery, or any of the other 19th century candidates people had floated. Later teams reran the whole thing with different methods and mostly agreed, including a replication in 2006. Then in 2008, a Stanford team led by Matthew Jockers ran yet another method and came out with the opposite headline, pinning a lot of the book on earlier fraud suspects, like Sidney Rigdon. So which is it? One detail decides how much weight that Stanford study can carry. Its method was closed set. It was forced to pick a winner off the short list of names it was handed, with no option to say none of the above. And a Brigham Young University statistician named Bruce Shalya later showed that once you open the set up and allow that answer, the confident attribution falls apart. Now, I'm not going to tell you stylometry proves ancient authorship, because the field is genuinely contested, and the studies on my side have believing authors, which you're allowed to factor in, but weigh the other side the same way. The Stanford method was set up so a fraud suspect could win and an ancient author couldn't, because no ancient author was even on the list. Bias doesn't only wear one jersey. So here's my honest read. The stylometric case against the book is weaker than advertised. The case for multiple voices is genuinely interesting, and the whole lane is methodology all the way down. Which brings us to the finding I flagged for you at the top, the newest thing in this whole subject, and for my money, the strangest. In August of 2024, a Brigham Young University linguist named Royal Skousen finally closed out the Book of Mormon critical text project, 36 years after he started it. A critical text is a scholarly reconstruction of a book's earliest recoverable wording. You build it by collating the original manuscripts, letter by letter, against every printed edition. Skousen basically did for the Book of Mormon what textual scholars do for Shakespeare or the New Testament. And along the way, he and a linguist named Stanford Carmack noticed something nobody was even looking for. The grammar of the original dictated text, the phrasing everyone had always heard as Joseph Smith's backwoods English, the "they was," the "in them days," turns out to match published English from the 15 and 1600s, early modern English. Some of those forms were already dying out before the King James Bible was ever printed, and they were long gone from books by 1829. Now, be careful with this one, because everybody wants it to be a weapon, and it refuses to be one. It cuts against the skeptic story, because a farmer imitating the Bible should hand you King James English, not grammar older than the King James. But it cuts against the tidy, faithful story too, because why on earth would a translation of an ancient American record show up in the English of Shakespeare's grandparents? Believing scholars are still arguing with each other about what it means, and I respect the finding more for that, not less. Nobody ordered this result. It's just sitting there in the manuscripts being weird, waiting on an explanation. And that, for what it's worth, is usually what real data looks like. And now the part I promised you. The Americas. The place where, if you ask the critics, this whole subject goes to die. I'm going to make their case first, and I'm going to make it properly. Here's the strongest, honest version of the case against, and I want you to feel the full weight of it before I say anything back. After nearly 2 centuries, not one Book of Mormon city has ever been identified on the ground. Not one. No inscription naming a Nephite king. No artifact tied to a single person in the book. No spot on the map where the field agrees, here stood Zarahemla. Compare that to the Bible. or you can walk the actual streets of Jerusalem and read the names of its kings pressed into clay. The Smithsonian Institution used to keep a standing form letter for people who wrote in asking, and it stated plainly that its archaeologists see no direct connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of the book. Michael Coe of Yale, one of the great Mesoamerican archaeologists of the last century, wrote in the journal Dialogue in 1973 that nothing he'd ever seen in the ground would convince him the book was anything but a 19th century creation. And he added that he didn't know a single professionally trained archaeologist outside the faith who disagreed with him. On top of that, the text describes things that, on the evidence we have, just don't belong in ancient America. Horses in the wrong millennia, steel before there was steel, and then the sharpest blade of all, DNA. The book describes families from the Middle East growing into great American populations. We can test descent claims genetically now, and study after study has found the ancestry of Native American peoples tracing overwhelmingly back to ancient Asia, with no Middle Eastern signal detected from the right period. And the Church itself has owned the force of this. In January of 2014, it published one of its Gospel Topics essays, that series of frank papers on the hard questions that I pointed you to last episode. This one, titled Book of Mormon and DNA Studies. It concedes the genetic picture, and it argues the book's people were probably a small group living inside an already populated continent. And 8 years before that, the Church had already softened the book's own introduction, which used to call the Lamanites the principal ancestors of the American Indians, to say instead that they're among the ancestors. That's the case. Flat. No cushioning. If you came here for a victory lap, this is the part of the night where I let you down on purpose. So what does a fair-minded believer say back to all that? 3 things, and I'll be straight about what each one is worth. The first thing, the small group reading isn't some panic move invented to dodge the DNA. Serious Latter-day Saint scholars were arguing decades before the genetic studies ever ran, from the text alone, that the book describes a limited region and a people living tucked in among others, because the story keeps bumping into populations it never explains. And the essay's genetics are real genetics, founder effect, genetic drift, the documented ways a small family's markers can dissolve inside a bigger population in a few centuries. But you've got to say the hard part out loud. Those are all reasons the test could miss them. And reasons a test can't see you are not the same as evidence you were there. Untestable is not vindicated. So the DNA stays on the critic's side, and I'm leaving it there. What it killed is the big maximalist folklore, the whole hemisphere reading. What it can't touch is the modest reading the text itself supports. The second thing, the anachronism list is real, but it's got a long history of shrinking. The book has people in the 1st century before Christ becoming, in its own words, exceedingly expert in the working of cement in a land northward. When that was dictated, it read as an obvious blunder. Then archaeology found that Mesoamerica went through an explosion of high-grade cement construction starting right around that very century, including floors at Teotihuacan, north of Mexico City, engineered so well they still beat a lot of modern building codes. So cement came off the list. Horses haven't. And an honest person keeps track of both. Barley is a stranger story. The book prices wages in measures of barley, and for well over a century, that read as one more import from a New York farm, because everybody knew the Americas grew no barley before Columbus. Then, in the 1980s, archaeologists working ancient sites in Arizona reported domesticated little barley, a Native American grain, farmed centuries before any European showed up. Before you clip that for the group chat, hear the whole sentence. Little barley is a different species from the Old World barley, and Arizona sits a long way from anybody's proposed Book of Mormon setting. So this one didn't suddenly prove the book. It moved from impossible to unresolved, which is a real move, and exactly the size of move this subject tends to make. And the third thing, the ground itself has barely been read. This is where that lost city from my cold open belongs, so let's put it where it goes. The city is called Valeriana, published in the journal Antiquity in 2024, found because Luke Auld Thomas thought to go back and reanalyze an ecological LiDAR survey, laser mapping that strips the jungle away in software. Under canopy that surveyors had walked right past for a century sat 6,764 structures, a city that might have held 30 to 50,000 people at its peak. Here's what it does not do. It does not mention Nephites, and its boom years, roughly 750 to 850 after Christ, land a full 3 centuries after the Book of Mormon's own story closes. So any thumbnail telling you Valeriana proves the book is selling you a parallel, the exact cheap move I told you we were throwing out at the start. And the channels running those thumbnails did not read the paper, because the date is right there in it. What Valeriana actually shows us is humbler and still important. The map isn't finished. Entire cities of tens of thousands of people were sitting there unrecorded under the trees into this very decade, which means every sentence that starts "Archaeology has found no trace" has to end with a quiet little clause in the fraction we've actually looked at. And that clause doesn't rescue anybody's certainty. It keeps the question open in both directions. And keeping it open is all I'm asking it to do. All right, let me pull it all together, and then I'll tell you where I actually stand, because you've earned that by sitting through both halves. So let's lay it all out, cold. On the settled side, almost nothing, and that's true for both teams. But on the suggestive side, more than the dismissers ever admit. A burial place name carved into Arabian stone in the right century. A desert trail that turns east right where the text turns east, heading for a garden coast that's really out there. The oldest Bible text on earth, on metal, from Lehi's Jerusalem. Mirror writing tucked inside a farm boy's dictation. Grammar in the manuscripts older than the man who spoke it, certified strange by 36 years of textual scholarship. And on the critic's side, stuff with real weight too. Silent ground where cities ought to be. a genetic record that keeps answering Asia when the folklore promised Israel, an anachronism list that shrunk but sure hasn't emptied. So what actually changed by 2026? Honestly, this. The text side got stronger and stranger. The critical text finally closed, the language findings hardened. The ground side cracked wider open, because LIDAR spent the last 2 years showing us how much of Mesoamerica we've never read. And the noise got a lot louder, because there's a content economy now that makes money off both shallow takes, and it grew way faster than the scholarship did. What did not change is the verdict, because there still isn't one. Suggestive is not settled. And anybody selling you settled in either direction is just doing marketing. So where do I stand? I'll just tell you straight. My faith in this book doesn't rest on an altar in Yemen. If that altar crumbled to dust tomorrow, my faith wouldn't go with it, because it never lived there in the first place. It lives where the book itself tells you to look, in reading it and praying over it, and watching what it does to a life over years. But I'm not going to pretend the evidence means nothing to me either. There's a version of this book the critics promised us, the obvious, clumsy fraud that was supposed to fall apart at the first serious poke. And after 2 centuries of serious poking, that version keeps failing to show up. What the ground handed us instead is a book that's harder to explain than either side really wanted. And I've found I can live honestly right inside that. Faith intact, eyes open. The geography fights, the maps, that new theory pulling huge numbers right now. That's a whole tangle of its own, getting its own episode soon. So I'm saving my fairness for that one. But tonight, I want the comments to do what the algorithm won't. What piece of evidence, for or against, actually made you think? Tell me the moment, not your conclusion, the moment. The altar, or the DNA paper, or the chapter that folded back on itself. Whatever made you sit still for a minute. And since I'm asking you for yours, I owe you mine, both directions. The one that strains my skepticism of the critics the most is Nahom, because I can't get the arithmetic of that coincidence to sit comfortably. And the one that strains my own easy answers the most is that DNA essay, because I watched my own church sit down and concede a hard scientific picture. And that kind of honesty deserves to be met with more of it, not less. I read every comment, believer or critic, and this question is why the comment section of this channel exists. And if you want to check me, and you should, go start with the Gospel Topics essay on DNA studies on the church's own site, and Royal Skousen's critical text volumes, and read the critics alongside them. That's not a risk to your faith or to your doubt. It's just how the honest version of anything gets built. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.